everyone. Welcome to our panel on monetizing TV streaming and programming platforms. I think we have a wonderful panel here and we'll introduce the group shortly. But before we do that, I'd love to give you some stats about what's going on in the sector over the last year. It's been very dynamic, both from a video and also from a audio and music streaming standpoint, which leads to the question of, how many people are watching these programming platforms, and then how are they getting monetized, both from advertising and a subscription level. So somewhat interesting components here is over 100 million US households have a CTV connection, and that's quickly growing. According to eMarketer, in 2022, US CTV ad spending forecast will be 19 billion, growing almost 50% from 2021. And what's interesting there, that's making up about 12% of programmatic digital display ad spend, growing quickly. And so within, obviously, over the top TV or connected TV, you bring an element of now programmatic ad spend with a level of targeting and other components that we'll talk about shortly, that, gives it a whole different level of ad placement than, say, in a more traditional linear component. Ad revenues from Roku, YouTube, and Hulu will account to 50% of US CTV ad revenues this year, around that. Obviously there's a lot of new, what we call plus launches, Discovery Plus, Paramount Plus, Peacock Plus, in addition to what you had before, Apple TV Plus. You would think they'd get a little bit more creative on the naming, but what this all means is there's a lot more quality programming, which leads to a lot more ad spend growth within these areas. What's interesting, if you look at Paramount, they brought Yellowstone to the world, one of the top rated shows right now out there watching. And, I think what you're seeing is a lot of investment going into these streaming platforms on original content. On that note, Netflix came out and mentioned that over 50% of their content budget, I think over the next year, will be applied to original programming. There's a lot more competitive pressure rising here to grab market share, and that's leading to really, differentiating yourself through original programming. The other thing is we don't talk a lot sometimes about short form, but you have programming options out there like YouTube, etc. And the latest stats show that more than 75% of US adults spend up to 2 hours watching short form digital video content each day. So it's not just your traditional TV viewing anymore. The other question I thought was interesting is sometimes we have this millennial Gen Z group who are cutting the cords, along obviously with some of the older population. But as they take on some of these streaming services, they're known to cancel it. Are they coming back? And Deloitte did a recent study in August of this year where nearly half of the millennials and Gen Zers in the US reported renewing a video subscription within a year of canceling it. So they're seeing the value there, and you're seeing definitely multiple subscriptions being applied to. So one part we might bring up today on our discussion is how big a wallet share can go to all these streaming services, as there's many new ones probably being launched in 22. Finally, it's not just video. Obviously there's audio and music. Podcasting is starting to really take hold with ad revenue, on a global number of monthly podcast listeners that increased by 15% over the last year, and it's anticipated to be over 400 million in 22 worldwide, about 20% of all internet users. But ad revenue in podcasting is still pretty early, but growing quickly. IAB is predicting the US podcasting revenue will go from $1 billion this year to about $2 billion next year. Obviously, very different than the video ad revenue world. On the music streaming side, it's obviously healthy and thriving. You have definitely a shift in how people are listening to music streaming, partly helped with COVID. There's about 500 million worldwide music streaming subscribers, of which Spotify's premium service is about 107 million of that. So, there's lots of audience out there listening and watching these programs. So now the question is, how's it being monetized? So with that, I'll introduce my panel here. And maybe Mary, I'll start with you, and then we can go next to Sol.
Sure. Thanks, Peg. Hi, everyone. Mary Hamilton. I'm with Accenture. I'm a technologist, actually. So I lead our technology innovation for North America and Latin America for Accenture. And so I look after our research and development, our rapid prototyping, our partnership with startups and the venture community, and then just kind of incubating and bringing new technologies to life. And over the years, I've spent a lot of my time with media companies, helping them with their innovation strategies, how to apply those technologies to innovate around the next generation of what's coming.
Great, thanks. Sol?
Hello there. Sorry for the delay. I'm Sol Berman. I'm with IBM Consulting, and I'm a strategist. Grew up as a strategy practitioner at BCG, PwC, and IBM, and been leading our strategy practice off and on for many years. Now lead our Salesforce Alliance as well as serve as our chief strategist, and have been working in this space for many years. Wrote a book called Not for Free from Harvard many years ago, 10 years ago now, talking about monetizing some of this content, and talk about some of the other things like vying for attention and the open media company of the future and the end of television as we know it, all of which have seemingly finally came to fruition, and we can talk about today, I'm sure.
Great, thanks, Sol. Rich?
Hi, Peg, thanks. I'm Rich Sutton. I've been a Chief Revenue Officer in digital media, so that includes OTT and digital video for 25 years, half of that at Warner Brothers, stops along the way at WebMD and Everyday Health. Been a consultant for the last couple of years, a handful of clients, a couple of them digital media startups from Europe, and one a digital tech company on the West Coast here in the US.
Thank you. Dan?
Hey, Peg, Dan Callahan, SVP of Data Strategy and Sales Innovation at Fox, really focused on helping brands unlock the portfolio from an audience targeting, creative innovation standpoint. And a lot of the things you mentioned in the preamble are what we're focused on. And again, forging those partnerships to help brands reach these audiences in new, unique, custom ways, and find out different exciting ways to help measure their conversions in commerce, and excited about the return path data and a lot of the new measurement capabilities that are percolating here at the start of 2022.
Great, thanks, Dan. Andrea?
Hi, my name is Andrea Zapata. I am the EVP and head of data research and insights for ad sales at Warner Media. I'm excited to be here because all the stats, all the metrics that you were saying at the start, consumer behavior has indeed shifted. And yes, Sol, it's about time that we start not only thinking about, yes, the migration and conversions are real, but how do we start monetizing it appropriately? Content has never been free. It's expensive. Measurement is costly, especially if you're doing it cross-platform and deduping across more advanced audience segments in more data-driven ways. And I will say I've been at Warner Media for about 6 months now. I spent the previous 10, 12, 15 years working with set-top box data at Comcast. Saw the early days of Hulu, where quickly learned that if you put really good content either across a desktop, a television, or a mobile device, people will indeed watch it. They will binge, care if it's new or if it's library content, it's new to them if they discovered it. And I spent a lot of time, 8 years prior to that, at ESPN, where I learned that live is real, fandoms are real, and again, content is not free. Happy to be here.
Great, thanks. Yeah, we'll get into some of that binge watching trends shortly. And again, for everyone out there, Peg Jackson with Stifel here. I help focus on M&A and IPO work within the ad tech and martech area, and prior was in venture capital around media and martech, and did operational work at NBC. So I've always been passionate about video and the trends within the sector. So so let's kick it off. As we just had mentioned earlier in the stats section, CTV and digital ad spend around video is way ahead of forecast and growing really nicely. Like to go into a level there and what you guys see as the trends driving some of that. Are we seeing some of the bigger media companies getting the lion's share of that? What we will see is, maybe some of this over the next year or two as the bigger entrants, really start to come and put resources behind it. and any shifts you see in the ad business model. So subscription, as Andrea mentioned, binge watching adds a whole different level of how to target and relate to people, maybe other content that they might like since they've binged, these 10 other episodes. So yeah, why don't we, Mary, I'll start off with you and then we'll open it up to the rest of the group.
Sure. As I think about the trends and kind of taking that future view, I mean, obviously, we're seeing the growth, and a lot of the big players are taking up, gaining a lot of that market share, especially as we're all home watching a lot of content. But I think there's a few things here at play. I think one, consumer behaviors have shifted. Their demands are changing. And we recently did a study, 6,000 consumers. Basically, consumers said, 60% of what they're paying for is not relevant to them, right? So the models that consumers have to use to consume the content isn't really working for them, right? And how they find the content, they're looking for better aggregation, better personalization, et cetera. So I think consumers are going to drive some of the behaviors and some of the shift in what they're looking for. I think there will be more tolerance for ads. I think, ads have been around forever. As we're seeing with the subscription, people are getting content maybe that they don't value. So, kind of taking that ad-based approach helps target some of that. And then I also think on the flip side, if we look at the future of what's going to be provided in terms of streaming content, I would say, the sky's the limit, right? We're today talking a lot about traditional video media content, but once you have that access to the consumer and access to them in their home, what else is there? And if we think about content in broader terms, gaming, right? Retail, shopping, right? Think about the live streaming that's happening in China. That's a total different shift, the way we think about content, live events, consumer driven, like, fan created content, fitness, right? We're doing partnerships with a company called Swift, Peloton, think about the kind of content and how they're shaping things. And of course, what's coming with the metaverse, right? And where's that going to go? And what does that content look like? So I think all those different content types, the sky's the limit, right? We go past that and move into these new areas of more lifestyle engagement and enablement. And then the third piece I would say, just kind of think about from the future perspective, is how content is going to be created, right? The value, the more content you can create that's high value, personalized, et cetera, the better off you're going to be, right? You'll get more ad revenue, better subscription, better customer satisfaction. And so we're seeing things like AI starting to shape the way we either understand trends, right? Macro, micro trends, and also just help with, content creation, quality control, increasing that throughput of better quality content. There's a huge shift, I think, coming for us in how content is created using technology. So I'll pause there, but a few things to think about.
Thanks, Mary. Andrea, from your side, I know we talked about the binge trends, but anything else from your side that you see there?
Yeah, well, to build off of what Mary was saying, it's no surprise that now consumers are saying, the way in which I get content is just not the most ideal, right? They said that about the cable bundle. They're saying it now about every single app they have to subscribe to. Our research shows that, the average household subscribes to between 5 and 7, sometimes more than 9 different apps. So obviously consolidation is the name of the game in the future, whether it's going to be, ad supported or not is important. I here at Warner Media, we live in the world of making sure that we can provide content to any type of user and consumer, whether it's in an ad-free environment or an ad-supported one. And one thing that's so interesting is across our portfolio, IP is truly the name of the game here. It's what do fans want to watch? Where do they want to engage? Where do they want to consume their live news, their live sports, their entertainment? And do they want to do it the way I joke a lot, God intended, with a channel remote and a surf and a lean back experience in a linear environment? Do they want to do it in a more choice, personalized way in a streaming environment? Do they want to do it on the go with their phone? And our ability to be there with the right stories and then demonstrating ultimately one to our users so they can, short finite window of time, still queuing for advertisers, then also be able to demonstrate that with data across our house, right, making the advertising experience much more personal or the content experience much more personalized, or whether we can demonstrate efficacy. One, for our advertisers who support much of our revenue models here. And it's all becoming very interesting right now, especially as we try to think about being more respectful to that consumer experience and making it more personalized. But I will say, at the end of the day, I spent a ton of time with HBO Max, and we see when there's, when Sex and the City comes back, when there's a Harry Potter involved, when there's friends that can be a part of that experience, people will lean in. It's just, how do we on the advertising side want to think about making sure that we're being smarter about serving up an ad experience, whether it's 2 ads per pod, whether it's 7 ads per pod, whether it's surrounding specialized IP and syndication, and then how are we measuring it? Are we still using Nielsen? I mean, Mary, what does your future say? Are we still using Nielsen, right? Are we actually thinking about better ways? And we're at Warner Media actively looking for alternative measurement to think about higher value metrics to bring to our advertisers and how to actually think about value in places where we exist and place their ads.
Yeah, and I think we'll get into ad insights in a second, because I think that's a critical point. And I just did renew my HBO Max between, I think it was the Matrix and the Sex and the City. You guys have a lot of great content coming out. Dan, before we jump off this topic, I think you mentioned something really interesting about the e-commerce connection, right? And now we have, IP related video coming into the in the homes in whole new ways, but you still haven't really seen, I don't think, that real commerce link as much as people maybe predicted in the last, couple of years. Obviously there's promotions to go buy something, but any insight, or Rich or Sol, anything here on how you might see the commerce angle evolve with these programs in the future?
I think broadly, Fox is proudly ad supported, plan to continue to be, and planning for the masses, having something year round, not having to compete for user subscription or retention. I think the SVODs have a tough road ahead of them, right? I think they've already felt that, seen that. You look at some of the content programming budgets that some of them have publicly, said they're going to try to achieve in the next 4 or 5 years. It's going to be tough and expensive to maintain these walled gardens. And I just don't know if there are enough homes that are willing to subscribe to 7, 8, 9 services, Peg, like you mentioned. So, Fox is going to continue to be proudly ad supported. I think we're well positioned with our streaming services and Tubi to support that. And Sol touched on it. It's all about that trade of time and attention. And is that worth $20 a month, or is that worth 90 seconds of your time? I think the audiences, to Mary's point, are going to continue to sort of drive and dictate what that looks like and how and where they choose to spend their time. But to answer your question on the commerce piece, I get excited about the connected TV because of everything that's possible from that measurement standpoint. I think it unlocks new ways to target, certainly enters and opens the door to everybody right now who I think feels like they have a chance to take a shot at Nielsen or become the new incumbent. I don't know if anybody really is cut out to replace them in their entirety, but I do agree there's probably better ways to measure cross-screen and think about convergence. I'm excited and opportunistic that we will find a more representative data set that speaks to video in totality and can better measure video across all endpoints, whether that's that lean back remote cable subscription environment or the Tubi streaming environment. But the data, in my opinion, that's available through that connected TV, which is hanging on the wall, that can give TV the credit it deserves. I think get some of that attribution credit, prove out that that IP address or that user went and visited a website, made a purchase, acted out on a behavior after an exposure to an ad in an environment is really exciting. And I think that's kind of the linchpin to continuing to see growth in, let's call it, video investment within premium long form ad supported content.
Yeah, the question is, how much can we get for it? It's growing. The experimentation continues. And the question is, when will we hit the wall? And are we headed back to the future? We're having more and more intense competition. Are we going to go back to rebundling as we've seen in the past? Does the consumer now think bundling is not the answer, or bundling is the answer? Is it a la carte that they wanted before? But I'd suggest there's one thing we're going to see, which is more, if you will, variation, not just in the content, not just in responding to the data about the content you offer up, but around the business models. And increasingly, Hulu and Disney have done some experiments in the space with pricing with ads, without ads, with the subscription, without the subscription. But increasingly, people are going to be able to, if you will, choose different packages. Packages will be customized to the individual. So not only with content be a channel of one, the subscription or funding service might be a channel of one, and you can make that trade-off. And that's out there in other businesses today. You can pay with miles, or you can pay with dollars, or you can pay with a mix of the two. So I think we're going to see more of the examples of retail and the airlines and some of the pricing variations and monetization variations coming to play in more forms and being more customized here, because I'm going to suggest we're not going totally back to the future, but we do tend to bounce around the edge of the extremes and then find a norm as the service becomes more mature. And that's what's going to happen over the next 5 years in this business.
So Sol, one thing to your point, and then Dan to yours about e-commerce. So if streaming goes the way of online subscriptions, particularly online newspapers, where if you live in Dallas, what's the #1 newspaper in Dallas, Texas? It's not the Dallas Morning News, it's the New York Times. And why is that? Because consumers can only handle so many subscriptions. So it may be expanding now, but it'll be interesting to see what happens in the future. And then Dan, on the e-commerce front, one of the trends I'm seeing with my clients is, since the changes in iOS back in the spring of last year, folks are having a really hard time with both direct-to-consumer retailers and folks who are doing customer acquisition, because the response that they were getting on Facebook is tanking. In some cases, it's down 60%. One of the places where they're having success, and you would think that this would be obvious, but it hasn't been, and that's YouTube. YouTube is a channel that's been used largely for branding and for influencers, but not so much for customer acquisition and e-commerce. And we're starting to see people have success there, particularly using some of the new tools that take advantage of AI and machine learning. So those are my two things.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So using more short term and YouTube to drive a purchase or an understanding of a product or something like that, or, working with influencers. Yeah, it's a whole new type of, programming level to think about. Let's jump into sort of another topic here. I think when we think about CTV here, it adds a whole different global component to here. We talk a lot about the US stats, but one thing that was surprising to me is, and to a lot of people, I think, is how Squid Games kind of took over the world this year, right? And that was, programming out of Korea, and obviously you're seeing a lot of really international content now being able to reach the US audience in a whole different way. Mary, maybe, you can elaborate a little bit on what you were saying about the Chinese live streaming, but how do we see now this sort of global influence that we're starting to see on these programming channels from both a content and maybe a viewer perspective, that might have been different, when you think about the cable world, 4 or 5 years ago, that, maybe wasn't as integrating of this international content and components like that. So, and maybe other things that each of you guys are seeing internationally that, is working that, might be interesting to our audience.
Well, I think that I'll just jump in quickly. I think that moving into international markets is a top priority at Warner Media, especially for HBO Max. But it's a hard and tricky thing to do, right? It all goes back to content and having authenticity and relevance within storytelling that's one, specific to the marketplace, but then also to your point earlier, having that Squid Games that can be sort of a global takeover and everybody can be equally freaked out by it, right? And I think there's not as much content that can probably scale at a global level. So it's finding that right balance. And I think that, ultimately, the content will resonate, and Warner Media, Warner Brothers has been in the business of telling stories that are not only unique and special to an audience, but can also scale. And so, I'll give it to Mary here, but I do think that it does go back to IP. It does go back to content first. And ultimately, yes, the user experience. Then yes, absolutely, how many bundles do we want to have, and does it need to be ad supported? And ultimately, how personalized do you want to make that advertising to the said customer, which is something we're all having to tackle. And then how do you measure it? But I do believe strongly that is the content that needs to resonate within each market. And Mary, I don't know what you have seen that would maybe either contradict that or enable that.
No, yeah, I totally agree. And, I think it's where the consumers find value, right? And where they find interest in content. And I think it's different by geography. It's different by generational. I know my kids, they would just sit on YouTube and watch short clips of things all day long, right? They don't have the attention, for the long form as much as maybe some of the other generations do. And so and I think that example of just how much the live streaming content has, taken over, gained prominence in places like China. There's really something interesting there. And a lot of it can be enabled by, kind of some of the tech tools, right? The AI to help them, better understand their audience, right? Be more interactive with their audience. I think that's, another trend that we're seeing on the on the global spectrum of allowing more of that interactivity and immersion into the content that I think is interesting to play off of. And Rich, I loved your point around people can only tolerate so many subscriptions, so they're kind of going for the bigger ones. But how do we also, and people still crave that localization, that community, and especially during this pandemic, there is absolutely a throwback to nostalgia, right? And my local community, and how do I stay connected? So people are looking for that. And I think some of the global things we're seeing are kind of happening because of that.
Yeah, we've been saying for years, you have to be global and local at the same time, and both extremes are just starting to be taken advantage of. We really haven't cracked the nut on both of those at this point, but increasingly we're a global world. The internet has made us that way, and you can offer global content. But when you offer it globally, it doesn't necessarily mean you offer it to different countries as much as you offer it to different communities. Might be a language speaking community, might be heritage. There are other facets to this, as well as being local during this recent period became very important. And the question of, is content still king? We talk about it as it is, and I would probably say it is as well, but the winners right now are not largely the content companies. So when we look at who's winning in this game, it takes more than content to win. We say data is queen, and we would say the platforms that can bring it all together, like a Salesforce or a CRM platform, are really the cavalry here that can make it happen. And our most recent research that we're about to publish for NAB, we can get it out in time for CES, of business executives in this industry, is shocking, because it says that 2/3 of them are saying we need to be closer to the customer, we need to know more about our end consumer. 2/3 of them are saying we need AI, we need data, we need to be able to put that all together. And less than half of them say they've invested in it or have the capabilities in-house to do it. And this is not a new issue. I'm sure Mary and I and others have been talking to them about it for 10 years, but we're still not there yet. And, in the meantime, people like Netflix are continuing to lead in some of this activity. And so the money's out there. The question is, who's going to make the money and who's going to get the money at the end of the day?
And so if content's that king, what are you seeing? What do you view as sort of the leaders now? And obviously Netflix does their own content and licenses too. So it's a little bit
right.
of
But they bring the data to it, and they bring the analytics, they bring the capability. So if you were a traditional content provider, the kinds of content are changing. The studios haven't been very successful with short form content, though maybe some of the panelists want to challenge me on that. And people like YouTube and TikTok, this year is probably the one that's getting the most attention, where people are spending their time. If we're vying for attention, they've got the attention, and the traditional companies are letting this happen around them. So they've both got to be better with the data, which is the gold or the new oil, to capitalize on that. And they've got to be able to bring that to the content, to take advantage of the content libraries, and their content libraries have got to be current. People can consume content much faster than in the past. They take out the ads, they binge watch, and just having a few good shows in your library is not going to be good enough anymore to keep their attention. And you got to have new content every day to keep their attention. And that's coming from social media.
Yep.
Well, it also goes back to like, where do the ad dollars want to go as well, right? So definitely consumers can be there, and then it goes back to, well, who wants to support it, right? And where are the places in which an ad, a 6, a 15, or a 30-second ad can go from branding to consideration to conversion, and then how do you count and measure that? And I think that's sort of the conundrum right now. And you know, I sit in a house right now that is just really rich with beautiful content and storytelling. So I'd be remiss not to talk about that. But you're absolutely right that data is vitally important to making an ad experience or a viewing consumer experience that much better. And you know, Dan had mentioned earlier, you know, he'd be hard pressed to see if anybody can replace a Nielsen. I'd say, gosh, bring it. I hope so. Because what they've done is so blunt and so basic. They basically said you can reach this many people, this many times, for this long across the most basic of screens. And we know that that's not where consumers are right now. And while, yes, reaching scalable people is still vitally important in a media mix, it's how do you then account for the TikTok in that media mix and the attention there? How do we think about putting a beautiful, well-lit platform like HBO Max into that media mix and count it appropriately? And then how do we think about those who, again, are living in the land of a linear environment because they like to, right? And it goes back to the investment in showing that it worked. Outcomes is really the name of the game now, right? And so I don't know. I think it's an interesting thing to think about where consumers are going to go. They feel really comfortable. They have short attention spans. They like the TikTok. Who doesn't like a good TikTok? I've learned all my dance moves from it. I could spend hours and then at the end of it go, what did I just do? But then, you know, the brands that are there, you know, they're hesitant, and they should be, as they are in other places and in other environments. But if it works for them and they can show with data and analytics and actually move their KPIs in ways that matter, but that's when the dollars will flow. But if we've learned anything, it's that this takes a long time to do. Just because audiences are there and scaling doesn't mean that dollars will flow or measurement will flow overnight. It takes all of our concerted efforts to make change happen. And I think that's where, you know, we're sort of sitting at that crossroads or the conundrum that is real when it comes to managing change.
Yeah.
I would say, I think if you put the consumer at the center and think about what experience they want to have, right? They want to have their profile of, you know, what they like in TikTok be applied when they're watching HBO Max, right? They you know, they want to be able to go back and forth and know that you know them as that individual, as the consumer. And right now, as you said, there's no data. There's no way to understand the consumer across all the channels, all the platforms, all the things they interact with.
But imagine how scary the world is, though, if we had access to all that data, because that's another question, right? Like, how much data are we okay with sharing in order to make it that much more personalized, right? And I think, obviously, that's just getting tighter and tighter and tighter as far as privacy is concerned. And we are uber sensitive about the data that we have and making sure that we're being compliant.
But we said that for years, that it has to be opt-in. If you give the consumer the choice and you give them some value in return, you can't force them to do things. I remember the vice president of television at Disney about 10 years taking her college-age daughter to college and setting up her dorm room. And we told the story of how she nailed the television set to the wall because her daughter didn't want a television set. Consumers today don't want to watch the ads. And we better recognize that. We better make something we're providing in that value exchange more of interest to them if we want them to take advantage of the opportunities we have to offer them, which we can do, but we can't do it by just throwing any ad against the wall and seeing what happens.
Well, on that topic of, you know, obviously the private, do we feel like, you know, now that the ad ads are more IP internet based, more programmatically delivered, through partners like Trade Desk, et cetera. Is that, the same privacy laws that we're seeing applied to, regular, internet, advertising going to creep into our living room now in terms of, either the opt-in or the, disclosure and all those components. How do you see that evolving? And maybe Rich or Dan, you might also have some insight there.
So if you look at what continues to go on in online advertising, particularly with fraud and non-human traffic, look, those problems are already coming to OTT. And OTT is an environment where there is no opt-in. So at least online, there's an opportunity when you're collecting data to get people to opt in. But in OTT, it's assumed that you know who they are because you've got either their streaming subscription or their cable subscription. So I think that there's going to be a lot of issues not too far down the road. If you look at the RFP process that the ANA just went through, they interviewed 75 companies to deliver a solution for all the problems in programmatic in digital. Yes, applies to OTT, but they were mainly thinking about online. The head of the ANA said, he called the marketplace riddled with material issues, including a lack of transparency, fractured accountability, and mind-numbing complexity. And when you look at the solutions to the problem, they're crazy complicated. I think OTT just adds another level of complexity to it. Mm-hmm. And we've seen problems, but we haven't seen legislation yet. And I think there will be.
Yeah, and I think you're seeing some new partners into the ecosystem. Like we mentioned, Trade Desk is having a bigger world at play here than other, maybe in linear. Obviously, you have companies like Caden that, is helping place CTV Standard Media Index as a augmentation to Nielsen in the CTV world. So I think you're going to see that ecosystem evolve, as the market requires it to, in that sense. So we have about 5 minutes here, I think, left. One thing I always think it's kind of fun to maybe close out a panel is, if you're seeing some interesting company or product or app recently, either in your business or personal life, that you sat there and say, hey, that was, a pretty cool discovery or something that you're going to have a decent influence on, you'll see you have a good influence in the next couple of years. So why don't I just open it up and see if there's anyone here who wants to suggest something.
Well, I can start, and I'll offer up two. There's a French company that's coming to the US called Video Run, and they're in that space that I talked about before, customer acquisition and e-commerce, specifically on YouTube because of an algorithm that they've developed. Very successful in Europe. I think they're going to have a good run here in the US. And the other talks to the other thing that I just got on my soapbox about, which is privacy. A company called Safeguard Privacy just did a deal with Bank of America, and they give companies the assurance that they need that their GDPR and other privacy legislation compliant, which is a big deal for every Fortune 500 company now.
Right. Anyone else?
Trust and compliance are certainly big issues. One that's going to make that even more, some ways better and in some ways challenging, is cryptocurrencies. And we haven't talked about that here. But some of the NFTs like OpenSea, we think are going to be important players in this space in the future, with the ability for the individual artists, musicians, perhaps as the starting point, artists and and content providers as well, to control and monetize their content, to make money out of it, to create a safe environment, or at least a trustable environment to do that in. And so we could see major changes, and waiting for somebody in this space to take a lead in that business.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. That's a great point. Yeah, NFTs, we could have next year. We'll have a whole panel just NFTs.
Well, as long as we don't have to talk about Meta and virtual reality.
Yeah.
I mentioned the metaverse, so we got the word in.
Anybody else on
3D
interesting
TV?
products?
Bring that one back.
No, no.
Anyone
I've
else?
had cool VR stuff recently. I think experiential sports training, ways for quarterbacks to go through simulation and not go through the contact of a sporting event. Cool company called Iris Tech doing some stuff there, as well as medical school stuff. So being able to go through the look and the feel of an operating room, maybe without having to do it on a cadaver or in practice as a student doctor on a real patient. So I think that there's a lot of growth in that space. And yes, metaverses, we were almost there. I think gaming is going to be huge. You can make the case that a lot of these video games are already metaverses to a certain extent, where you are a different character or an athlete, and you go in and there's ads in the stadium or branding in Fortnite. I had a quick one for Sol, right? I mean, I think the model, right? We go back to the consumer sits at the middle. Is that optionality of the consumer the decision between their wallet and paying for ad-free and don't track me, trading track me and serve me some ads, or don't track me but serve me maybe more ads, right? So there's this 3-degree tier of full ad light, ad free, consumer chooses, and we all have to sort of support those different relationships based on trust or how much they value our product.
I think so, and I think it's going to vary with the content. I may watch ads for some content, not other content. So it's not just a subscription service one way or the other. It's I got my choice, and you've got to be able to deal with that variability.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one interesting company I saw is Jelly Smack, who does a great job of having user-generated content find their audience in this sort of hyper-vertical world, right? That I do think you'll start to see a whole level of verticalized channels developing in an interesting way, but how do you connect them with the audience is going to be room for where some players will be. And Andrea, I think I cut you off there, and then we'll close it out there.
No, well, actually, I was going to say, I sit squarely in measurement. And so I think a lot about how do we count things better. So I'm really excited to see not just about alternative measurement for counting, but also for efficacy. And there's a company called LoopMe, Zappy, who are, before you used to have, a 10 million minimum impression level for anybody who cares about these things. And like very few campaigns could actually get measured on whether resonance happened or consideration. And I think, with LoopMe doing, literally 1 million impressions and actually getting a real statistical read on it is awesome. It's game changing. It allows us to really think differently about how to not just count, but then also measure, did it work? So and also any new TikTok viral video I'll be watching for sure.
I see you dancing.
I was also going to throw out there, I think there's there's a lot of interesting players in the, user-generated content space, right? And giving people the tools. We were working with a company called TouchCast, and they create, really high-end, almost immersive, right? Kind of getting towards that metaverse view of, kind of connecting with your content in a different way. And then, I know it's not a new one, but Wattpad, right? The whole fan fiction idea, and using AI, applied to all that information to say, hey, you know what, this story is really popular. That's kind of macro trend, but also like, what are those trends we're seeing across? Like, oh, you know what, this story is about zombies and, medical zombie stories or whatever it is, being a trend and being able to pick up on that and quickly turn around content. I think that we're going to see a lot more of that in the future.
Right. Content being driven by AI, in terms of select. Well, thank you, everyone. I think that completes our time here. I know it's flown by, and really appreciate you presenting here at the Digital Hollywood panel, and looking forward, hopefully seeing you next year. Take care and have a great 2022. Thank you.
Thank you.